Welcome to the Grow Your Law Firm podcast, brought to you by Pilma. This podcast helps lead lawyers to more growth, profit, and freedom. Here is your legal marketing expert and host, Ken Hardison.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Ken Hardison, and welcome to another episode of Grow Your Law Firm. And today we have the honor and privilege of having Tom Lenfestey, a CPA, lawyer, and business owner, who is going to talk to us today about buying and selling law firms. And Tom, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And so you own the Law Practice Exchange company, which you broker law firms, people that are trying to sell their law firms, and we'll get into that more. But tell me how you ended up owning, tell me your path. How did you end up getting into law, CPA? I know you do business and tax planning, things like that. Tell me your journey.
Sure. Well, I started out, as aspirations way back of being a lawyer, right? Political science major. And then I was drawn more into the, finance business side of things. So I switched to an accounting major and kind of went that path, and then still ended up at law school. I tell everybody, really, the Law Practice Exchange came about. I was in private practice for a number of years, really from the, attorney advisory, CPA advisory side, putting together or helping, transact the deals for other professionals where they could exit their practices for value, right? Build it up, sell it, exit, retirement, everything else. And I got jealous. I'd like to tell everybody that it was this, full mission out of the gate, but I think really it was, how come it seems like all these other professions had figured out how to do it when lawyers, there was just a lack of education or knowledge out there. So back in 2012, 2013, I started the Law Practice Exchange really to do that. We started as kind of an education first, and then really building the model to offer really solo to small ownership groups, right? So those firm sizes could vary, but that's really our target kind of group. Offer them continuation strategies for their firm, what they built, that it can continue on with somebody else. And then on the buy side, it's, the opportunity for the next generation or firms looking to grow, they can grow through acquisition.
Yeah, but I know, because I look at your website all the time, and I know that there's some law firms up there for sale for $4 or $5 million. You got some big firms too.
Absolutely. Right. Size, like I said, the size of the firms really vary. It's a credit to those owners and what they've built versus anything we're doing. But, we've had firms that have one owner, $9 million a year in profits, right? 40 some million dollars a year in revenues. They've just built a really good machine. A lot of lawyers aren't like that. A lot of lawyers are more typical, making a few couple $100,000 a year. There's a place for them as well. But everybody asks me, what's the standard, on law firms, whether it's multiples or anything else. And it really varies because the business models, are as different, as creative as the lawyers who run them.
So what are some of the biggest, well, I don't ask you this first. Has COVID had any effect on law? About people buying, selling law firms? Have you seen, has that made any effect at all, or not really?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. COVID's had an impact. It really, when COVID hit in March of 2020, March, April, even May, the deals that we had pending at that time really stretched their due diligence timeline. Some stalled, some fell apart, right? Buyers that just got concerned. Anything else. But really coming out of that, I'd even say like the tail end of May, we saw a big resurgence or a big push for bankruptcy practices. Some lawyers were really looking at, we're heading into that world. We had some smaller bankruptcy practices listed. But then what we've seen in the last 2 years since that, Ken, is really a pickup and a stream of the buyers now are looking for growth in different ways. A lot of traditional marketing has changed, right? So as, networking in person or, those referrals or otherwise, and if you have a growth plan, one is now maybe acquisition looks to fill some of those voids that you can't do or couldn't do during the height of COVID or anything else. The other part, I think, was the remote aspect of things, right? Here we are recording a podcast on Zoom, all of the other things. But as everybody got comfortable with, potentially not just meeting clients remotely, but also managing, remotely and having teams work remotely. Now the hub and spoke expansion model for a lot of firms has really caught hold, where the owner or the management don't have to be physically on site. And that really drove, I think, our buyers who ran existing law firms, right, looking for growth, but looking for geographic, kind of the spoke model, right, to add to their operations, everything else. And I think the other piece that we saw was towards the tail end, now we've seen of COVID, the sellers who were holding on, our senior attorneys, they were a little bit more motivated. And I think we've seen some of them, stabilize their practice, but essentially say, enough's enough, right? I don't need to be dealing with this again. I financially am at a place where I don't have to work. I built a good practice. I'm ready to turn it over to somebody else. And COVID was just a good motivation for them.
We're putting on this big event, and you're, one of the keynote speakers as buying and selling law firms. It's going to be June 30th at the Ritz-Carlton, and we'll have some information at the end of the in the notes of the podcast. But one of the reasons that I really felt like, I just feel like I like to be on top of what's going on. I like to be relevant, and I think what you said, plus I think a lot of baby boomers are coming to that deal. There's more of us like me. And I do think you're right. I think that the fact that people saw all this SBA money out there, there's so much more availability of funds out there than there was even 5 years ago. It's easier to get money to buy a law firm, which used to, when I sold my firm in 2010, forget it. There's no bank, nothing, nobody's going to loan anybody money. You either got the cash or you had to finance it, or part, or a mixture of that. So I think the timing and like you said, the technology, I just think a lot of things have converged together to make it. What is it? It's all about timing. I think now's probably the time, since I've been practicing law, that you're going to see a lot more buying and selling law firms. And plus, I think people are getting ready because of non-lawyer ownership. I don't think that's going to be as fast as everybody thinks it is, but I think it is coming. I mean, it's already in Arizona, but I think it's going to be a lot tougher. I do think there's going to be some things that are going to affect us just by Arizona being there, and I won't get in that today because that's a whole nother episode we can talk about. But
yeah, and I think, Ken, to that point, I mean, we're excited about the event in New Orleans, just the opportunity to really talk about what is the state of the marketplace, what is the roadmap if you're interested in being a buyer or interested in being a seller. I think you've put together, a great panel of those experts to help on funding, to help on structure, because that's really what we found is, there's a lot of interest in this space. It's just learning, what does it look like? What do structures look like? What do terms look like? What funding is available, right? And so that's the hope, coming up in June, that we'll be able to really share that and everything else, because it is changing quickly. To that point of like talking about non-attorney ownership, I've had more conversations probably in the last 6 months with equity, private equity, than we had in the previous several years, because they're starting to pay attention, right? And on the flip side, we've also had a lot of, pretty savvy business owner lawyers looking at, well, I can go and acquire practices right now at potentially a lower value, build it up, and as regulations change in the next several years or whenever, then my exit may be at a much higher, multiple higher value overall. So I think it's a really interesting time as this space really kind of changes slowly in a way, but also a lot of ideas swirling. And it's just the questions of, what's the right option for me? That's really, again, hopefully we'll give people those ideas and maybe those solutions in June down in New Orleans.
I mean, we don't have time to go through this. That's why we're having a one-day event, and I got you, which you've got knowledge for years and years. And before you even had this law firm exchange, you were handling these deals on a weekly basis. But what the biggest thing that worried me, and I think it always worries everybody, is tax considerations. And I've heard of things called ESOPs. I don't know what they are. Hopefully, I don't know if you want to talk about it today or you want to wait till the event, or you don't want to talk about it at the event. But in one of my masterminds, we had a guy that he was looking to sell his law firm for 50 million. So he had a big firm, okay? And he brought some of his lawyers in, and they were talking about, he was just telling how hard it is to avoid the taxes. And he was talking about ESOPs. And I still don't remember what all ESOPs are about, but I don't know. Can you educate us on that? What the tax considerations? I mean, do you pay capital gains? I mean, can you get even cheaper than the capital gains rate, or what's the deal?
Yeah, I think the first thing to realize is, again, how that deal is structured. If you're going to look to sell, right, an ESOP is an equity sale, right? So you're going to sell like the equity, the stock, the LLC membership, anything else. It's, more complicated and beyond my knowledge. There's ESOP experts out there. But overall, from a tax side, it's very similar to, again, a stock sale, which you're talking about, pure capital gains, or maybe better, right? So everybody wants to pay capital gains at, 20 to 25%, maybe a little less, typically not, instead of the 40 to 45%, all right? Especially when you're dealing with big numbers, because the savings become substantial. Overall, what I tell everybody is, the first thing we look at is most of our deals are still structured as asset sales or asset purchases. And usually the key there is to make sure that your purchase price is allocated as much as possible towards goodwill, which is really actually a pretty easy structure in a law firm sale, because most of it is goodwill, right? Goodwill meaning the brand, the reputation, right? The referral sources, the marketing, everything else. You don't have a lot of tangible hard assets, right? And everything else in, plaintiff side firms, you are going to have an inventory of cases that may have to count for some portion of that. But anything that's allocated to goodwill is also capital gains. So even if a deal is an asset sale, it's divided, and you want to make sure you push as much as possible towards goodwill versus the other assets. The other assets like accounts receivable or furniture, fixture, equipment, maybe some of these inventory of cases, those could be ordinary income. So on a lot of our law firm deals, we see, 80% towards goodwill. That means capital gains, and then maybe 20% towards the other, which could still be capital gains, maybe with some ordinary income. But there's lots of other strategies as well to kind of structure and take it from there. But the key part is, before you sign the deal on a letter of intent or any kind of structures, just know what that's going to be, because the tax hit could definitely be pretty significant. The other is to look at installment, structures. There's lots of estate planning techniques when you get to the higher amount, if you want to do some generational gifting, some other strategies like that to minimize.
So if you're a buyer, on the other hand, I would think that you wouldn't want to be the stock. You wouldn't want to buy the stock, because then you're buying the liability of the corporation, right?
You are, but we found pretty good strategies. And as long as the buyer feels good about what they're buying, the seller can indemnify, right? Kind of promise to make whole, the buyer, if any liabilities, I didn't pay my taxes fully in 2019 and that pops up, right? So we can have the attorneys legally prepare for that, escrow a certain portion for 12 months. There's lots of different opportunities and creative structures, especially when you get to the bigger amounts, right? Because, the bigger amounts, the small percentage of taxes matters more. And so the only good part is we have a listing up in Canada, and I was just talking to that client about their tax regime, and you almost feel fortunate to be in the US when you compare, taxes on the Canadian versus the US side. It almost makes you feel a little bit better, right? But there's definitely, burdens either way, but there's good strategies. The key is, don't sign the deal without really looking at those strategies. So something we really try to go through is work with, the client's CPA, or bring our own deal knowledge. As I joke with people, I'm a CPA, just not your CPA, but to bring that, to the table to make sure that it's going to be tax advantageous as possible. And yeah, the buyer wants, typically doesn't want to buy stock or equity. Sometimes they can do that. But if they do buy assets, they will get some deduction as well for the purchase price on that. And so that can be beneficial to kind of do hybrid approaches or otherwise.
So, the big question, and you've alluded to it, but I just want to point it out because this is the number one question. Whenever I start talking about this with any lawyer, in fact, I had a lawyer ask me this yesterday, Tom, do you know anybody out there that actually evaluates law firms? Because that's the big question they want to know when they talk to me about it. How do you figure out what it's worth? And everybody, you, Tom Mackey, everybody I talk to, they say it depends. I mean, it really depends, but I guess it does depend. But what are the ranges? I mean, in case our listeners can get some idea what's the lowest or what's the highest ever seen. Kind of give us some broad range there. This episode is brought to you by Pelma Super Summit. June the 27th through the 29th, you can come and learn how to take your law firm to the next level in New Orleans at the fabulous Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Go to pelma.org/summit.
Yeah, absolutely. And, because it's still a young marketplace, it's confidential, right? So it's not like these are registered like with real estate sales and you can really look and say, here's a perfect formula. We don't have, 3 decades of transactional information. But overall, I mean, our approach is to look at, the various methods and really apply the highest weight to the one that makes the most practical sense for the firm. And so as an example of that, like everybody's heard of, the revenues approach, which is, what you're doing in revenues. Typically the standard is it might be 0.5 times those average revenues up to maybe 1, maybe a little bit over depending on the practice. So simple example, you're doing $1 million in revenue. Maybe your firm is worth a $500,000 or maybe it's worth $1 million or over, right? The earnings method on the flip side is really how well you're running the firm. And so it really gets down to what is your owner benefit, your owner cash flow, or what's called adjusted EBITDA. And under that same scenario, if you're running $1 million firm and you make $300,000 truly as owner's profit, typically our multiples are somewhere between 2 to 3.5. They're starting to push up actually, depending on the practice areas, everything else. So we're starting to see more kind of push up towards the 4. Some people are excited about that. Some people say that's way too low. The overall aspect I tell everybody is our buyers are still lawyers, right? Who are mostly risk adverse, and our funding is still self-funding, meaning the equity groups and others are willing to maybe debt finance, our SBA lenders, whatever else, but it's still us taking on the risk to be the buyer versus somebody else's money coming into play. And so for that, you have that earnings approach. The other one, we deploy market comparables based on the data that we have. So if we're looking at a personal injury practice and, it's an inventory driven practice, otherwise, we're going to compare that to closed transactions or open offers that we have to really see what is the state of the market, for that price now. And the last piece, which we really like on plaintiff side firms, is an inventory of cases that we value under an asset approach, similar to what debt finance and funding sources do, right? Really go through and take a discounted approach to what the case or the inventory of cases you have in the firm. Honestly, Ken, some firms, that's their highest value, right? Is they've just brought in certain cases or certain significance of cases, or they built up this huge inventory of cases. We've seen it also because of COVID and the courts closed down and everything else, that inventory is kind of built up, right? But they haven't been able to try or settle. It's definitely dinged their financials on earnings or revenues over the last couple of years. But we're going to put more weight towards that asset because that's going to give us the true value, right? The true value is it's sitting on the shelf and going forward. And even though they didn't bring it in 2020 or 2021, it's going to come in 2022, 2023, or 2024.
So what trends do you see going forward? What do you see? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think you've already kind of alluded. We've got more funding coming to this space, every day. So I think those opportunities, whether it's private equity, looking to pair up with, certain attorneys or certain firms, whether it's SBA, whether it's other funding, it's just going to make it easier to get these done and more favorable from, honestly, the seller and buyer side, because the seller can get a little bit of their cash off the table at closing, right? Or their equity off the table in cash, and the buyer can get the favorable terms. and these deals can get done a little bit easier and less costly. I think we're going to see more and more attorneys looking to retire in the next, 5 years, the ones that have held on a little bit longer, right? We're all attorneys. We really don't like to think about retirement all the time. But I think overall, we've started to see that pace pick up, and we'll see it more. So that'll create more inventory in the market. Hopefully it'll start to fill what I'll call some of our pent-up buyer demand, which we have right now. We have buyers saying, I need this type of firm in this geographic market. We don't have it. But as those sellers come to the market, right, hopefully we'll fill some of that and kind of really, move it forward from there. And then, like you said, the wild card is non-attorney ownership. I don't think it's going to move that fast either. But I think the fact that, both Arizona and Utah kind of jumped, and there's, 20 other states or so in committee, with some consideration of it. It's coming. It's just a matter of when, and then what impact it would really have in this space. And I think the biggest thing is, bring in private money, to the deals. Now it's not my money as a lawyer and an owner of a firm at risk potentially to go out and acquire. It's, a private equity group's money.
They've done this in Great Britain. They've done this in Australia. And the stuff that I read, Tom said that only like less than 25% of law firms were held by non-lawyers, And in fact, I know one big law firm out in Great Britain, I think it was, went bankrupt because they paid too much for some firms. You know what I'm saying? They overpaid and they couldn't get their margins and they went under. So you look at I always like to look at what other, see what other, where it's been before, and it's been there, and you can look at that and get a pretty good idea of what to expect.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the similar note, Ken, I think you and I look at things, along those same lines. I look to the other professions, kind of one of the reasons I started Law Practice Exchange. But, as a CPA and accountant, I think the first top 20 CPA firm was just acquired by equity, right? But that opportunity's been around for a long time. And it's taken that long really for an equity group to get to that point to say, we're ready to, pull the trigger on a big firm. There's some other accounting, other practices that of course they've acquired, but I think the same thing in law. There's some already doing it under a management, type structure, right? They own the management company. The management runs different things, and then the law firm, of course, is lawyer owned. But I do think it'll take a while. I think certain practice areas and practice types won't change at all. I think it'll just be certain spaces and certain, areas and whatnot that will do it. But equity's pretty cautious too, right? So our conversations with them is not like they're ready to go and deploy all their millions right now. They're waiting, and they'd like to know and do their research and kind of monitor to see which are the right opportunities to do that. So I think you're right. I don't think things are going to drastically change like a lot of others fear. I think it'll just take a little while, and it'll be a little shift, right? But we'll see where it plays out.
Is there anything that I have not covered that you'd like for our listeners to know about buying and selling law firms? I know we can't tell them everything, but.
Yeah, can't tell them everything. But what I'd say is we just put out, our annual trends report. I look forward to hopefully sharing some of that at the event, in June down in New Orleans. But it really shows kind of just how we're building based on a market, what buyers are looking for, potentially, the demographic. One of the interesting parts that we're seeing, Ken, is our seller age is actually going down a little bit. It's a small sample, but the neatest part to that is we're starting to see attorneys who have built pretty good practices who may be in their, late 30s, their 40s, and are deciding, hey, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm going to go do something else, right? Sounds crazy, like a Ken Hardison, right? Like, you're going to exit out and go do, something. We had one that honestly developed a software company and was going to go do that. And so to me, that's a really neat thing, because then you're really not just talking about a certain generation, right, and exiting and retiring. You're talking about a free market exchange of practices that may be very technology driven, very marketing driven, like they were built, in the last 10 or 15 years to do so. And those are being exchanged over to somebody else. So that's pretty exciting to see kind of that age and demographic shift and everything else.
That's interesting. Actually, when I had one of our PILMA members approached me about that, he went and got it evaluated, and he come back. He said, he's like 44 and doing like 7 million net and 4 million, and he's working like maybe 50 hours a month. And he said, I can't really see letting it go right now, because I told him, I said, you'll never get the money that you deserve for it, because you just run such a tight run operation that, the best margins I've seen in a personal injury firm, to be honest with you. I hadn't seen margins that good, not for that kind of money.
Yeah, and I think that's it. The challenge is you either make it into what we were talking, prior to recording, a lifestyle business, right?
Yeah.
And, the example I gave of, 40 plus million in revenues, 8-9 million in profits every year, like that owner didn't even go into the office, right? For years, they had built it into what is now in their, senior years, a lifestyle business. But the hardest part for them is they didn't have, a lot of their leadership, everything else were of similar age as they were. So they were going through a succession, structure, not just by ownership, by management, right? Their top tier management really needed succession. So yeah, you can build it. And then it's always to have that exit strategy in mind and kind of know the path, which is, part of the exciting part. The timing is everything, but knowing what your potential options are when you're ready to kind of deploy and say, now's the time, I've gotten out of it, I'm ready to do different things, and I know what my options are, that's powerful, right? Attorneys like knowledge, we like to research, we like to know all the factors, all the risks before we make a move. And that's a lot what we'll talk about and share, because I think if you know those options, you can choose the one that works for you when it works for you.
Listen, Tom, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you down in New Orleans on June the 30th, which is following our PILMA Summit. That's going to be going on for the 13th year this year. I think it is, yeah. 13th year that we've done it. And that'll be the 27th through the 29th. And then we follow up with this buying and selling law firms. And I look forward to seeing you down there, my friend.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Before you go, give out your contact information. I almost forgot that. Okay,
Absolutely. So Tom Lenfesty, you can find me at thelawpracticeexchange.com. That's thelawpracticeexchange.com. We're on the socials as well. So you can find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Everything else can be kind of linked. But yeah, feel free. Again, happy to be a resource. We like answering questions. We like, seeing if we can help create more of these opportunities for people. So give us a look at thelawpracticeexchange.com.
All right. Thank you. Until next time, this is Ken Hardison, dedicated to your success.
You have been listening to the Grow Your Law Firm podcast, the podcast that leads lawyers to more growth, profit, and freedom. Go to growyourlawfirm.com to find more ways to market and manage your law firm. Please leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts.